Hello, everyone, and welcome to Adult Education at Covenant Presbyterian Church for April 11th, 2021, the second Sunday of Easter. Let us pray. Holy and gracious God, we give thanks for this day and for the glory of your creation. We give thanks for the technology that allows us to gather together and the opportunity to do so to serve your name. We give thanks for our partners all around the world, for our siblings in Christ, and for your beloved children, whom you call your own and whom we are blessed to call neighbor. Amen. Our guest here today is none other than Jed Koball. Jed is a mission co-worker in Peru, and a number of us here have met him in person, and now we have the opportunity to meet him virtually. So Jed is here to talk to us a little bit about what he has, what he's doing down there, what life is like in Peru, and what's going on down there. So I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about it, because clearly I don't know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to spotlight your video, Jed, so your face is going to come up big on your screen. It's always a little alarming when that happens, but here you go. And everybody else, I am going to mute you.
There I am. And do I have screen share capability? I do. Fantastic.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Jeff, for this invitation to be here today. And thank you, Charlie, as well, for the invitation to be in worship this morning. It's wonderful to be with all of you today. You have been in our hearts and minds for a long time now, and certainly over this past year. So it's great to be with you in this way this morning. I'm going to share my screen and optimize for video clips. And hopefully you are seeing my screen, correct? Thumbs up. Good. And here we go. So Jeff asked me, oops. The invitation was, I've got a sensitive mouse right here. The invitation this morning in part was what's going on in Peru. How has the pandemic affected us and affected our ministry? And so I want to share our story down here. Pandemic in Peru, a long and winding road ahead. Peru has been hit, the whole world has been hit incredibly hard by the pandemic. And Peru has its own unique story within that. And I want to share some of that story today and how we are responding to the road ahead that awaits us with our partners and with Presbyterians. So I am Jed Koball. My wife is Jenny Baez, and our son Tiago, who just turned 4 this past week. We live in Lima, where we are right now in our apartment. And where we've been pretty much all the time for the last 13 months. And you may hear Tiago at some point in the background. They are post-breakfast playtime. And so I'm sure you might hear some screaming and laughing in the background. That's just Tiago having fun. And that has been the primary focus of our life this past year, is keeping Tiago happy, healthy, and as he deals with this pandemic with us. So Jenny, if Tiago permits, may drop in and say hello at some point. So I'm going to take you on a journey of the pandemic here in Peru and looking ahead, but we're going to go backwards before we go forward. So our roadmap this morning, I want to take a look back at some of the impacts that the pandemic has had on us here in Peru, kind of paint some broad strokes of the effects of the pandemic here. And then I'll transition into how we are responding to the pandemic, the particular challenges of the pandemic itself, and how we've had to adapt our ministry at the same time. Both with our partners here in Peru, as well as with Presbyterians in the US, including folks like yourself. And so we're going to look how we've been responding here in Peru at the very local level, community-based ministry, at the national level through some of our advocacy work here in Peru, and then more globally as well, how we are addressing more global systemic issues in relation to the pandemic and other matters here in Peru. And through all of it, how we're Presbyterians are walking with us in this ministry. So let's take a step back first. This is a picture actually from the window of our living room here in our apartment, looking out over the city. This picture was taken around late March of last year, 2020. Around March 6th to be specific of 2020, the first case of COVID-19 was detected here in Peru. And on March 16th, with no notice, at 8 p.m. at night, the government declared a state of emergency and shut down the entire country, giving us 4 hours notice. And in 4 hours, the entire country shut down. Highways were shut, borders were closed. There was no transportation at all. No one was allowed outside their apartment, their house, wherever they lived, except to go to the grocery store or a pharmacy, and one person per household was allowed to do that. And so very quickly, we adjusted to lockdown. And one of the first things we noticed was the horizon. Within a matter of days, a smog that has covered Lima for decades lifted. And in the background, you can see the foothills of the Andes Mountains. Lima is right on the coast on the Pacific Ocean, and the foothills of the Andes butt up right against the city. When there is smog here, which is pretty much any day, every day of the year for year after year after year, you can only make out sort of the edge, sort of the first range of mountains, of foothills. But within a matter of days, the smog lifted because the city had shut down, and we could begin to see three and four ridges beyond the first set of foothills. And so we could say, hey, something has definitely changed. We can see it with our very eyes. There's no longer smog in the air. Maybe it's not all so bad. And so it felt like something was being exposed. The city, we're seeing the city through new eyes. But it didn't take long after a few days before we began to see what else was failing, or what else was being lifted. And that was the veil was being lifted of a system, an economic system here in Peru that really was failing. For 20 years, Peru has been hailed as this dynamic economy that has been growing and growing and growing. And indeed, the macro numbers suggest that Peru has had steady economic growth since 2000 up until the pandemic. But what we realized when the smog lifted within a few days, and within a week, that it wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. Initially, they said the lockdown was going to last for 2 weeks. And so we sat patiently. And as the 2-week mark approached, they said, no, it's going to be 2 more weeks. And at that point, people on the edge of the city began to get up and leave. And there was a mass migration. People literally leaving the city because they could no longer put food on the table. What we saw is that all this economic growth of the last 20 years had really only helped a small upper class and a middle class, which was growing, but there was a substantial number of people living on the edge of poverty who had now tumbled completely into poverty. We realized that 60 to 70% of the population, working population, had informal work, which is to say there was no benefits, there's no safety net for them. They were living hand to mouth. And because they could no longer go on the streets, leave their homes to work, they had no money to put on the table, to put food on their table. And so they began to leave the city, returning to the mountains or to the jungles where they may have had family or may have once lived years ago, to go to a land where they could at least plant food or find some other way to live. So there was a mass migration. And of course, what we didn't know at the time, but suspected, was in that mass migration, they were not only carrying their bags and their clothes with them, they were taking the virus with them as well. And so the virus in that way began to spread throughout the country. But there was still this massive food insecurity. There are people who could not put food on the table. Particularly, we saw that here in Lima early on. And so we realized this economy that was growing substantially for some was not helping others at all. And so there was a tremendous wealth gap, which has now increased substantially. After 4 weeks of lockdown, they said 2 more weeks to 6 weeks. And after 6 weeks of lockdown, it ended up becoming 4 months of lockdown. We spent 4 months in our apartment, and I was the only one to leave in 4 months, and that was to get groceries once a week. Our poor Santiago didn't see the light of day didn't leave the front door of our apartment for 4 months. And even now, to this day, 13 months into this, he's only allowed outside for about an hour a day to run around in a park. Playgrounds are still closed, as they are in most places. There's no schooling, in-person schooling. The school year starts in March, so the pandemic started right when the school year started. So all of last school year was virtual, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. And all of this year is expected to be virtual as well. And he's in preschool, so he's doing online preschool. You can imagine how that's going. But what we learned this past year was, because it was all virtual schooling, 2/3 of school-age children did not get any education last year. 2/3 in the entire country of Peru did not get any education because they could not access virtual education, particularly outside the city, with lack of internet access, or because they had no one there to push them. Parents kind of gave up on the year. So there was also tremendous neglect of a lot of children, and we learned there was an increased rates of a lot of domestic abuse over the past year because of the emotional turmoil on families, and that continues to this day. And so we speak of the forgotten, and for most of last year, it was the children who were forgotten, and so that has become a particularly new focus for our partners, for some of our partners going forward. So we learned that, so this economy that was supposedly growing, it didn't invest in education. It didn't invest in infrastructure over these past 20 years of growth. It had one of those smallest percentages of GDP invested in education. It also had the smallest percentage of GDP throughout the Americas invested in healthcare. So there's a lot of money being made over the last 20 years, but it was not being invested back into society, into education or healthcare principally. And so as the virus began to spread, despite the fact that we had these draconian measures of lockdown, it was spreading nonetheless. There was no health infrastructure to combat it. And so ICUs quickly filled up. They're filled up to this very day. And medical professionals continue to say, the best thing you can do is not get sick, because if you're going to get sick, we probably aren't going to be able to take care of you. The healthcare system had not invested in basic maintenance of its infrastructure over these past 20 years. So the medicinal oxygen plants were not working. So it was estimated by the World Health Organization that Peru had on hand about 10% of the medicinal oxygen necessary to treat those who were able to get into ICU. And so you would have these long lines outside hospitals and clinics. People with these canisters of oxygen that they bought off the black market, and they're being sold for thousands of dollars per canister, which is a tremendous amount here in this economy. And you would find one family waiting outside a clinic while another family was inside, sitting bedside by their loved one who was on the last moments of life with their oxygen, and the family outside who couldn't get into the clinic waiting for that person to pass away so they could both get their bed and get their oxygen. And so there were lines of people waiting for people to die and waiting for people to take their oxygen. There's still a shortage of oxygen today. We've made some progress on that, and I'll touch a little bit on that again later. But it wasn't only oxygen, it was the different medicinal responses to treat COVID aren't as accessible here. Some of the wealthier countries in the world quickly bought up the different medicines that have proved to be effective in treating COVID, and those cannot be accessed here as easily. So this economy that I keep speaking about that grew so much over the last 20 years, but seems to be failing us, is an economy that is built based on mining. Mining is the heart, it's the backbone of the economy in Peru. Everything from gold, copper, silver, zinc, lead, just a number of metals and minerals that are shipped in around the world. It drives the economy here. And so it controls the government here. And so this economy, which creates wealth for a few and leaves a tremendous gap for the rest, was basically given a free pass during the lockdown. It was one of the few industries, apart from the essential industries, that was allowed to keep running throughout this whole lockdown. The logic being that, well, we need it to keep running to be able to recuperate our economy. And so certain favors were given to it as well. Not only did it not lock down, it continued to operate, but environmental rollbacks happened as well. So environmental protections were being erased, and there was no monitoring from the state over environmental regulations. This has been an issue of our partners dating back for many years prior to the pandemic, and an issue we've been addressing because there are so many communities throughout Peru that are impacted by mining activity. A third of the population is at risk. Peru has roughly 33 million people. So we're talking about 11 million people are at risk from contamination from the mining industry in Peru because of environmental liabilities, leaks from different chemicals from the mining process. So our partners have been addressing the issue of health of people for a long time already. And now with the pandemic, these particular communities already affected by mining contamination were at further risk with the virus at hand. There was an attempt to, and still an attempt to address these environmental issues. But what we saw was there was also a harsh response. 5 environmental activists this past year were assassinated in Peru in an attempt to address the power of the mining industry here. And in the midst of all this, the truth was not coming out. We didn't know for a long time just how bad the virus was here, despite these really strict quarantine measures, which are considered among the strictest in the Western Hemisphere. Peru, we learned in the latter half of 2020, had the highest mortality rate in the world for much of last year. Presently, it's not the highest mortality rate in the world, but it's still within one of the top 10 highest mortality rates. The official statistics right now, so a population of 33 million, roughly a tenth of the US. We've had officially 54,000 deaths. So 10 times that would be over 500,000 in the US, roughly on par there with the US. But they're saying that's the official government record, but others who are monitoring what's happening here are suggesting that the reality is closer to 70 or 80,000 deaths. So there's a lot of death happening that's just not being reported or going unseen. And in the midst of that, as the world is now trying to catch up, return to some normalcy, there is what we're calling a vaccine apartheid. As of today, roughly 35% of the adult population in the US has received at least one dose of a vaccine. In Peru, it's about 2% of the adult population. There are still 30 countries in the world that have yet to administer a single dose of the vaccine. Why is this? We can go into a lot of conversation about this, but in broad strokes, at the beginning of the pandemic, the wealthier countries of the world, which, there's roughly about 10 countries in the world that have about 75 to 80% of the vaccines in hand right now. And because they put down a lot of money up front a year ago in purchasing vaccines before certainly they had been approved. Countries like Peru, which are considered a middle income country, wasn't able to negotiate, couldn't put money down up front. It had to wait to see which vaccines were actually going to work before it could negotiate for them. And so it couldn't join the game of negotiating until late in the game. And so it just now has deals for vaccines with Pfizer, with Russia and the Sputnik 5, and with China for Sinopharm. And so vaccines, there are deals for vaccines, but we're at the end of the line for receiving them now. In Peru, it's estimated that we'll be vaccinated by the end of the calendar year. I think my age group will be probably around November of this year. But for much of the world, it will still not be until mid-2022 or until 2023 before they're vaccinated. This is a problem, not just for those countries or for Peru. It's potentially problematic for, and I'm not trying to spread fear, but it's potentially problematic for the US as well, because it's in that lapse of time, new variants can arise. And we don't know how the current vaccines will be able to respond to those. So it's of everyone's benefit that everyone gets vaccinated as soon as possible. And on top of that, there's simply the economic return to economic growth for many of the countries. The gap is just increasing. It will continue to increase even wider as the US returns to normalcy, and Peru and other countries lag 6 months, a year, 2 years behind.
Jed, can I just jump in with a clarifying question?
Yeah.
On talking about the vaccine apartheid and the huge disparities, it's obviously disconcerting, troubling, sad. You described issues in Peru over the last 20 years, concentrated wealth and injustice, and obviously those issues play out on a global stage. I mean, I'm guessing that part of the disparity in Peru is due to the global disparities, and part of it is due to internal issues within Peru that,
it's both, right?
Leadership in Peru.
Yeah, no, it's complicated. There's definitely internal matters here, political instability that have not allowed Peru to arrive to the negotiating table for vaccines as best it could. But at the same time, it is also a matter of the haves and the have-nots, and the wealthier nations just being able to buy as much as they could up front. And I don't knock wealthier nations for doing that. I mean, if you're buying what you need to buy for your population, you're taking care of your people, and that makes perfect sense. But in a more practical sense of combating this virus, it takes a global effort. And so how can we be more cooperative? And I'm going to touch on that later on how what are some actions that could be taken to help countries like Peru and other countries catch up in the vaccine game that would not affect the rates of vaccination in the US or other countries.
Thank you.
And so now I've painted a terrible picture, very scary picture. And now I want to talk about how we're addressing this. And because we are an Easter people, at the end of the day, we rise together. It's a friend here in ministry speaks of us as molecules of water. He says each one of us is like a molecule of water. And when some molecules of water come together, they may form a drop of water. And when a few drops of water come together, they may form a ripple. And when many ripples come together, they form a wave. And a wave can change the landscape, which is to say, when we all come together, we can change the course of human history. We can make it better for everyone. And so we do this in partnership. We work together. So I want to take a look at how our partners, how we're responding together with our partners here very locally at the community level, and then later at the national level through some advocacy here in Peru, and then globally in some campaigns that we're doing with Presbyterians in the US as well. But first, who are our partners here in Peru? They call themselves the Red Uniendo Manos, which is the Joining Hands Network. It's a network, an ecumenical network of 9 Peruvian NGOs, non-government organizations, or not-for-profits. They're faith-based not-for-profits and churches. And they're located throughout Peru, from here on the coast in Lima up into the Andes Mountains and over into the Amazon jungle. And each of them individually is addressing particular injustices related to poverty and other systemic issues. But they come together to identify some common root causes of injustice and to generate solidarity around the world, in particular with Presbyterians in addressing some of these systemic issues of injustice. But early on in the pandemic, food insecurity was the issue. People couldn't put food on the table. And with the support of some, generous Presbyterians and through Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, we received some funds. And so at the very local level, we began to put food on the table, initially by simply buying groceries for families in need. And this evolved into something a little more. And I'm going to let Pastor Pedro Garcia, who is a member of our network and the pastor of the House of God Presbyterian Church here in Lima, he's going to share briefly about how his church addressed the issue of food insecurity.
Lanzamos la campaña El amor no está en cuarentena. A través de esta campaña ayudamos a 250 familias, proveyéndoles bolsas de víveres para que puedan sostenerse. Después de la cuarentena, apoyamos a las ollas comunes con la campaña Aíslate físicamente, pero no de corazón. Compramos víveres para las ollas comunes. Hemos apoyado a 30 ollas comunes.
So these 30 community kitchens that his church has sponsored, helped organize and support, as well as other initiatives of our partners around the world. We've been able to feed over 4,000 people through this pandemic, and that's with the support of Presbyterians in the US. The other issue of the children in education. One of our partners, network members here in Peru, has been addressing the issue of education, in particular for populations of particular need. And in this case, a population of deaf children in the high jungles of Peru. We've been working with them for a number of years now because the deaf population is largely unrecognized. There is no public school for deaf children in all of Peru until our partners began to created one with the support of Presbyterians a few years ago. But with the pandemic, their school was shut down. And so they needed to find a way to educate themselves virtually. Many of these families come from very impoverished communities. And we found that among their households, they may only have one device, that is like one cell phone for the entire family. And so if they have more than one kid and they have to access education online, they would favor the child or the children who could hear as opposed to the child who could not hear. And so with the support of Presbyterians and some grants, we were able to obtain tablets for the families of this school and also better internet access. And so they have been able to continue their education this past year and going ahead this year. But it's much more than education that's being provided here. And so I'm going to let the head teacher, Jesse Chavez, will talk a little bit very briefly about the impact of virtual education this past year.
Las clases no solo servían para dar clases de aprendizaje, sino que pudimos acompañar en tiempos de la pandemia, no solo a los niños, sino a las familias, poder también ayudar a sobrellevar los problemas emocionales de algunos chicos que hemos tenido con problemas emocionales. Eso fue algo muy, muy grato para nosotros, el poder mantenernos comunicados con ellos, porque era su única opción. En las familias sabemos que no manejan la lengua de señas, entonces el niño no podía comunicarse con alguien más, se comunicaba con nosotros, se comunicaba con Diego, se comunicaban entre ellos, y eso ayudó a que sea más llevadero este tiempo de pandemia, ¿no?
So the deaf community in the School for Deaf Children is that it's a community, because these children prior to this school's existence did not have friends, and they didn't have anyone to communicate with, because they didn't even have a language prior to this school existing. And so this school existed to give them a language and then to give them a community. And so when the pandemic hit, they were isolated and alone more than anyone throughout this past year. And so to be able to bring them together has been significantly impactful for their emotional status as much as for their education. And now a third response at the community level, one that your church is much more familiar with, and that is on the outskirts of La Roya, one of the most contaminated places in the world, where we've been working with the community of Villa El Sol and its reforestation project. This area is so contaminated due to mining activity, where we know that 1,000 square miles of soil is contaminated up to 4 inches deep with toxic metals. And so this community, there are tremendous health risks already prior to the pandemic, but making them much more vulnerable to the virus right now. But this community has been addressing this issue for years and years through advocacy, but also taking it to advocacy to try and get environmental protections and healthcare provided, but also trying to clean up its own land through reforestation and bioremediation. And you all came to visit this project a year and a half ago and helped with the development of the reforestation project. And over the course of this past year, they were able to continue work on the irrigation system for this land. And here, Victoria Trujillo, who some of you may know as Mama Toya, and her daughter are going to share the advances they made this past year.
21 hectáreas plantado entre quinoal, eucalipto, ceticio, pino, que ya tienen años algunos, y en la época de verano no tenemos agua. Entonces hemos estado haciendo nuestra laguna.
El apoyo que tenemos es tanto de la iglesia presbiteriana, quienes nos están acompañando y dándonos la orientación, el apoyo en cuanto a algunos materiales y todo lo demás en este trabajo de la construcción de las terrazas, zanjas de infiltración para la recuperación vegetal de nuestra área.
Those are 3 instances of ministry, what it's looked like this past year at the very local community level. But our network has also come together to continue to address issues at the national, more systemic level. And in particular, in relation to the issue that we just saw about mining contamination. For years, we've been trying to get specialized healthcare for communities impacted by mining contamination. Because of the pandemic, there was more openness within the government to address the issue of healthcare. And so this past year, a presidential commission was formed to address the issue of healthcare for communities impacted by mining contamination, and in which Yolanda, who you just saw in the past video, sits on that commission. This is the first time ever that a representative of this community has had access to the highest levels of government to address the issues of contamination and the health concerns related to it. Because what we know is in La Arroya, 98% of the children have levels of lead in their blood far surpassing World Health Organization thresholds. There's immense contamination among the children and everyone in that town. And it's not just La Arroya, it's in many communities throughout Peru. And so our partners here have helped organize those communities throughout Peru and now have a platform at the national level and a commission, a presidential commission, in which they can negotiate better health care. And so they've advanced very far this past year in that work on behalf of children in La Arroya. And Presbyterians are supporting the initiatives of our partners in other ways, and indirectly related, but very impactful nonetheless. This past year, the Peru Mission Network, which is a network of Presbyterian congregations and individuals in the US who care about God's mission in Peru, came together in 2020 and designed what is called the Presbyterian Tree Fund. It was to go before the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church this past year, but because of the pandemic, it was postponed until the following General Assembly in 2022. But in the meantime, it exists as a voluntary fund. And this fund is effectively a carbon offset program. Because when folks travel to Peru or travel anywhere in the world, they create carbon emissions that are a piece of climate change, of global warming that creates climate change, which has impact on communities like La Arroya. So it's mining contamination exacerbated by climate change. And so the reforestation work they're doing in La Arroya is tackling many fronts. And so the Presbyterian Tree Fund right now is a voluntary fund, which Presbyterians and the congregations, presbyteries, the Presbyterian Mission Agency can donate funds in relation to their travel, in which communities like La Arroya and elsewhere in the world and in the United States can access to support their reforestation efforts and or forest protection efforts. We hope that this will be adopted by the General Assembly, and so that the Presbyterian Mission Agency will make it obligatory for the agency whenever it travels, that it will contribute to this tree fund. So the Peru Mission Network created this fund this past year, and it is very much evolved out of our work in La Arroya with the reforestation efforts. And then one last initiative I want to speak to, and this goes back to Charlie's question earlier on about global vaccine equity. There is tremendous inequity right now. And I don't say that to generate guilt or anger. It's just to point the reality in this world. And we are not past this pandemic until everyone is past this pandemic. That's the reality. And we're not all going to get through this pandemic until everyone gets vaccinated, or until there's wide swaths of population vaccinated throughout the world. And right now, the vast majority of the world is very far behind. We don't fault, no one faults the US or European countries for having access the majority of vaccines. They did what was right by their population. But there are actions that can be taken to increase the production of vaccines. One of the most basic things that can be done, which is it's a contentious issue, but it's one that our partners are pushing along with Presbyterians, and it is a waiver on intellectual property rights of pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals produce vaccines, and They typically, by World Trade Organization standards, have the intellectual property rights of the recipe. So you create a recipe for a vaccine and you own the rights to that recipe typically for 20 years. Before then it is shared openly, and that's when you get generic brand drugs. We're calling for a temporary waiver of those protection rights so that the vaccine recipes can be shared more broadly so that we can generate greater production of the vaccines around the world. There are scientists working on this, how to do that effectively. But right now, there are countries standing in the way of removing that waiver, of removing those protection rights. And so we're calling for the countries of the world to say, remove those rights temporarily so that this vaccines can be produced more rapidly around the world. So that is an issue we're working on, and I have resources on that if you'd like to learn more. Now I'm going to end with this. I'm going to turn back to you. And you are a model and an inspiration, and you generate hope for us from Peru and for our partners, because at the end of the day, we have a long and winding road ahead of us, and we know we cannot go that road alone. We need to be in solidarity with one another around this world. And you have modeled that solidarity for us in the past. And you continue to model that for us even right now as you welcome me and my crazy ideas into your living room. We are grateful that you walk with us in prayer. We are grateful that you have come to visit us, that you support our partners, and that you take the time out of your day just to listen to the stories. And I'm going to remind you, I'm going to let Charlie and the folks from the trip in 2019 to have the final words of this presentation as they sing a song that they sung to us here in Peru at the end of their time together.
May the God of hope go with us every day, filling all our lives with love and joy and peace. May the God of justice lead us on our way, bringing light and hope to every land and race. Praying, let us work for peace, singing, share our joy with all, working for a world that's new, faithful when we hear Christ call. Dios de la esperanza, danos gozo y paz, al mundo en crisis habla tu verdad. Dios de la justicia, mándanos tu luz, luz y esperanza en la oscuridad. Oremos por la paz, cantemos en tu amor, luchemos por la paz, fieles a ti, Señor. May the God of hope go.
Oops. So may the God of hope go with all of us this day and every day. We are grateful for you, for your support, your prayers, and for sharing the story together and walking this road together. I'll stop there. I've said a lot. I've covered a lot of ground. I've shared some wacky ideas. And so I welcome your questions or stories of your own. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jed. I'm removing the spotlight on you so now people can shift to gallery view so that way we can better have the conversation. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for the information, for the advocacy and everything that you shared with us. I am wondering, in terms of the patent waiver, what does effective advocacy look like for that? And as people who are living in a country with great vaccine access, what is incumbent on us in order to help pursue justice in this front?
I have some resources on that, which, and I'm going to put in the chat right now. And about how to take action. First, resources background on it. some letters that the Presbyterian Church has written about this issue, and links to action you can take from your living room or wherever you are. If the hyperlinks do not come through, I'll send it to your email. But there's basically a standard email that you can send to your representative in Congress to encourage the Biden administration to temporarily waive the pharmaceutical rights to share the vaccine recipes.
And is that a legislative solution, or is that something that could be done on the executive level?
It could be done on, well, it could be done on the executive level. So we're petitioning for Biden, the Biden administration, to take this action. But if you can get your representative to push Biden, that can help. As opposed, you can both go directly to Biden or through your representative.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful to know. Yeah. Does anybody else have questions that they'd like to ask? You can raise your hand physically. You can raise your hand in the virtually. You could just unmute yourself and start talking. But go ahead.
Jeff Fox, this is Victor Villacrez. I'm a guest of Steve Whalen's on the call this morning, and we are involved with the sister city between Madison and Cusco. And a question for Jeff Koball. One thing that our group is trying to address is the offset of travel when we do go there and we do promote. And so I'd be interested to kind of hear a little more if you had any details on the tree fund, because one of our partners down there, suggested this and actually has, an idea for reforestation, and, there's somehow the two could work together. There would be, more willingness for people to travel, as they, go to, this Cusco area.
Yes, I'm trying to paste into, it's not working. I'm trying to paste into the chat right now more research, more information about the Presbyterian Tree Fund. And basically it's a carbon offset program, and it provides a link to a calculator, so you could determine, what would be a fair amount to donate to the fund. So there's not a mandatory or a rate that you should, or amount that you should donate when you travel, but it's up to you. And basically this fund would collect monies from those who donate to it. And then our Presbyterian partners around the world and in the US, for example, maybe in your presbytery, there's a reforestation effort. That effort could apply for funding from this Presbyterian Tree Fund. And the idea is that it's basically providing grant money to those who are doing reforestation work or forest protection work, such as protecting the Amazon or other endangered forests. So it's in that way, we consider it a carbon offset. So a certain number of trees planted, depending on the kind of tree and where it's planted, there's formulas, et cetera, but it offsets the amount of carbon you produce that is attributed to you when you fly on an airplane, for example, which is on a personal, in the grand scheme of things, our personal lifestyle is not the highest factor in creating global warming, but on, it's big industries. There's like 100 companies that really generate most of the carbon emissions in the world. But if you do want to take personal responsibility for your carbon footprint, oftentimes it is our travel, particularly air travel, that is one of the highest factors of our personal carbon footprint. So this is a way to offset that carbon production.
Well, and towards what you're saying earlier about the molecules and raindrops, yeah, me contributing, $200 to a carbon offset isn't going to save the world, but the more we do that, the more we cultivate that, it has a multiplier effect.
Exactly.
Yeah, I have a 4-year-old as well, so we've been reading the Lorax recently, and there's a bit of that in there. So Jed, I'm gonna ask you a question that's not about you. My understanding is that Jenny is the YAV site coordinator in Peru. So I have a vested interest in this. My wife was a Tucson YAV back before going to seminary, and I've got
Jeff,
a lot
can you
of,
tell us what a YAV is,
I
please?
will indeed. Thank you, Charlie. I'm just using acronyms. YAV is Young Adult Volunteer Program. It's a program of the Presbyterian Church that provides resources and structure for young adults, typically coming straight from undergrad, but not exclusively, to give them a volunteer year, to give them the structure for that. And yeah, so Jenny is coordinating that in Peru. And can you tell me a little bit about how her work obviously is deeply affected, but what things look like for the AV program in 2021?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so my wife Jenny, she coordinates the Young Adult Volunteer Program in Peru. So she typically receives 3 to 5 20-something-year-olds each year, and she places them with one of those 9 NGOs that make up our network. So they're scattered around the country. And in fact, they were here when the pandemic hit a year ago. And so we had when everything shut down literally overnight, and they were scattered around the country and they couldn't move. I'm going to sing her praises because she pulled some strings and worked some minor miracles to not only get them back to Lima, then get them back to the United States. It took a few weeks, but she was able to help evacuate them back to the US. So we have not had any in-country since then. So, and we are not anticipating having any young adult volunteers from the US for the 21-22 year. However, what she has proposed is trying a Peru YAV year, which is to say it has been a part of her dream that young adult volunteer group in Peru is not only made up of young adult volunteers from the US, but also from Peru as well. So she's going to experiment in the year ahead with having 2 or 3 Peruvian young adults who can work from home or in their local community. So she's exploring that option right now. And then beyond that, when folks can come back here, then the idea would be to have a mixed YAV group of Peruvians and US young adults here in Peru.
Well, that kind of seems like the fulfillment of what the YAV program strives for. That's really cool. Yeah, it is. There's some beautiful things have come out of this pandemic, as painful and as hard as it is. The creativity of the Spirit has been at work, I think, throughout the Presbyterian Church and around the world. So we're trying to lift that up and celebrate that. Jennifer, yeah, you go ahead.
You mentioned in your presentation about the assassinations of some environmental activists. So I couldn't help but then think of the young people that we met when we were there and their work, what risks they might be taking. And so I'm concerned about them and what they've been doing this past year. Yeah, they have not been threatened. Most of the assassinations that have taken place have been in the Amazon, and they've been indigenous leaders and some other activists. But nonetheless, up in the Andes, yeah, it's always risky when you're addressing the mining industry. I'm not aware of threats that they've received over the past year, but I also think folks have not been very active except for on Zoom. There's just most of our ministry has a lot of stuff has been like it is in the US. It's on Zoom. So, but if I find out anything more, I will let you know. But to my knowledge, everyone there is good. Thank
you. Yeah, and I guess this last one is a self-serving question. As someone who is working and also has a 4-year-old, knowing that you've been really engaged in your ministry with the 4-year-old, how have things been for Tiago down there? I know I've often said that if I could choose to be any age during this pandemic, I'd probably choose to be 4, but that's just because, you know, I've been pretty lucky with my 4-year-old, but how has it been to work with a toddler running around for you down there?
It's been, I remind myself every night that he is a blessing, and he has been a blessing, because definitely there's been long days and hard days, without a doubt. We have a relatively small apartment, and we've been locked down pretty seriously at times. But he turned 3 at the beginning of the pandemic. He's just turned 4. He's doing preschool online, which Zoom classes with 15 other toddlers is, you know, is just as you might imagine. So one of us, Jenny or I, he has 3 classes a day. We have to be by his side, through those classes. And otherwise, but I call it's hard. It's exhausting. I mean, just raising a kid is exhausting, you know that, but anyone who's raised kids, but it's been a blessing because he finds joy and laughter every single day. And so when I look out the window and I'm saddened, I'm angered, he's running around the room, jumping off the furniture and just having a ball. And while that might have upset me a year ago and jumping off the top of the couch, today I say, wow, he knows how to have fun in the midst of a pandemic. And so there's joy to be had, and that joy is contagious. So I think without that, it would have been very easy to have gone further into a dark place. And so I give thanks to God that I have had a toddler, exhausting me day in and day out for this past year.
If any of you don't already follow Jed on Facebook, it's worth it. And it would be worth it just to see the video that they posted this week. Jenny, God bless her, she was trying to do some relaxation exercises with Tiago, and he took a couple deep breaths and then just started belly laughing. It's absolutely hilarious. It made my day yesterday when I saw that. So, I'm not sure it made Jenny's day, but
I think she was more upset that I posted the video.
Yeah, no arbitrary screaming for no reason rule has been instituted occasionally at the Fox House.
Right.
But there is a lot of joy in it too.
Right.
Does anybody else have any? We have time for one more question if anybody has something they'd like to ask. If not, I'd gladly close us in prayer. All right. Well, thank you, Jed. Thank you for being here. We're really blessed to be able to partner with you. And I'm really thankful that we're able to have you here at this time in this way. So, you talk about finding the blessings of the pandemic. Just as a little taste of what's coming next week, we have Betsy Moe, who is a mission coworker in Guatemala, currently, I believe, in Washington State. She'll be Zooming in with us. So we're going to have over the next few weeks, we're going to have a taste of what our international mission partners are doing. Farsiana Deni Risakota in Indonesia will be speaking to us soon. Eric Miller in Kenya as well. So we'll be very blessed to hear about what's happening internationally as we remember that the answer to the question, who is our neighbor, extends far beyond our street, our immediate community, and our country. So thanks, Jed, for kicking this series off and for the ministry that you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's so wonderful to be with you. Thank you all. God bless all of you.
Thanks. Let us pray. Holy and wonderful God, we pray that your blessings may fall on all your children, that as your people may we work for your justice and peace, but as your people we may remember the wonder and dignity and value in human life and human flourishing, and that we may act accordingly. Help us to seek your kingdom and see the good in the world around us. remembering that your creation is good and that our role in it is to encourage that goodness to increase. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording.